This beggar girl saves a millionaire from an exploding car, but minutes later, something worse happens. Please rate my story from 0 to 10 in the comments. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The scream sliced through the muggy afternoon air in the historic town like a razor, echoing through the cobblestone streets at precisely 3 o'clock. The 52-year-old widowed millionaire, owner of the largest construction company in the region, nearly knocked over his coffee cup as he stepped away from the window of his luxurious condo. His fortune, accumulated over decades of investing in stocks and diversified assets, allowed him to live in the most modern building in town, but it couldn't buy peace for his tormented conscience. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For 3 weeks straight, that sound had been coming from the old Victorian house across the street, a faded yellow 2-story structure with peeling blue window frames that clashed with the elegance of his home. The businessman adjusted his tie before returning to work, trying to ignore once again the discomfort growing in his chest. As someone who had built a considerable fortune through calculated investments and rational decisions, he preferred to stay out of other people's dramas. Especially after 5 years of living alone, since losing his wife on a rainy night he preferred not to remember. The money he had accumulated in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies could not fill the void left by her, nor diminish the guilt he carried about the mysterious circumstances of her departure. Across the street, inside the Victorian house, the 4-year-old girl huddled in the corner of the kitchen, her small arms insufficient to understand why her aunt hated her so much. The 38-year-old woman firmly held a metal spoon she had heated on the gas stove, her eyes red from alcohol fixed on the child who trembled before her. "You're a plague on this house," hissed the alcoholic aunt, her voice slurred from the booze she had been consuming since noon. "Because of you, my sister is gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the girl's small arm, leaving a red mark that would join the other scars that dotted her thin skin. The child bit her lip to avoid screaming louder. She had learned that screams only enraged the woman who had worked at City Hall until she was fired for constant absences caused by her addiction. The little girl closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's soft voice singing that lullaby before she went to sleep. It was all that remained of her now, fragments of memories and a song that insisted on echoing in her mind in the most painful moments. "Stop sniveling," the aunt grunted, putting the spoon in the drawer as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. "Go to your room, and I don't want to see you until tomorrow. And if you smudge the walls again with that filthy charcoal, you'll see what real punishment is." The girl ran to the small room in the back of the house, a stuffy space with an old bed and a crucifix on the wall. There, she curled up in the thin sheet and began to hum her mother's song softly, the only thing that still comforted her. She didn't know that, across the street, someone had finally paid attention to that melody. The businessman stopped reviewing the contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His wife used to sing it when she cooked, a popular tune about free birds. But where was it coming from? He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the Victorian house. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there came that childish voice, trembling but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, the millionaire felt something other than simple discomfort. There was something in that voice that struck a sensitive chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. His investments in the stock market and the net worth accumulated over the years had built a barrier between him and the real world. But that familiar melody broke through all the defenses he had erected, bringing back memories of a time when he could still feel something beyond guilt and emptiness. In the house next to the Victorian, the 61-year-old retired schoolteacher was watering her begonias when she heard the girl singing. Unlike the businessman, she could no longer ignore the signs. During her 40 years teaching elementary school, she had developed a keen instinct for children in distress, and that voice carried a pain that made her heart ache. The educator dried her hands on her apron and made a decision. The next morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to the neighbor. It had been a long time since she had properly talked to the troubled woman, and perhaps it was time to get to know the little girl who lived in that house better. Meanwhile, the millionaire remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The music had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of his former employee who had abruptly resigned 5 years ago, a few months before his wife's accident. The woman was kind, always humming as she organized the construction company's files. Then suddenly she had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought of her again until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child seemed to be suffering in silence. The sun began to set over the mountains surrounding the historic town. When the girl finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear, her small fingers clutched the sheet, and in her dreams, she flew like the birds she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the backyard. Across the street, the businessman closed the curtains and tried to return to work, but he couldn't concentrate. His profits in dividends and the passive income he received monthly seemed insignificant in the face of that voice that kept echoing in his mind. Something had changed that afternoon, something he didn't yet fully understand. For the first time in years, he felt that maybe it was time to pay attention to what was happening beyond his own windows. Night fell over the historic town, but the echo of that children's song continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent 5 years running away from his responsibilities, and a retired teacher who had never been able to ignore the suffering of a child. The next morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical bustle of the historic town awakening for another day. The retired schoolteacher put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something in that child's voice that wouldn't leave her alone, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the Victorian house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until dragging footsteps approached. The alcoholic aunt opened the door with a bloated face and red eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's drinking. "Good morning," said the teacher with her gentlest smile. "I came to pay a courtesy visit. It's been so long since we've talked properly." The woman hesitated, running her hand through her disheveled hair. "Oh, teacher, it's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." The educator took a step forward, forcing the other to back away. "And I would very much like to meet your niece. I heard she's a lovely girl." The aunt's face hardened for a moment before forcing a weak smile. "The girl is sick. High fever. Better not to get close." At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. The teacher pricked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Maybe I can help," insisted the educator. "I have experience with sick children. I raised 3 kids. You know how it is." "No need. No," the aunt replied quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I already took her to the doctor. It's just a flu. It'll pass soon." The teacher noticed the woman's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol emanating from her even though it was so early. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades of dealing with troubled families. Across the street, the millionaire watched the scene from his window while eating breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confused dreams where the voice of a child mingled with memories of his former employee. When he saw the teacher at the door of the Victorian house, a strange curiosity washed over him. His businesses were thriving, with investments in mutual funds yielding considerable interest. But for the first time in years, something other than money occupied his thoughts. The melody from the night before continued to echo in his mind, bringing an unease that his net worth could not silence. The educator finally said goodbye to the aunt, but not before casting an investigative glance into the interior of the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. As she walked back to her house, she decided that she needed to find a way to verify her suspicions. Inside the Victorian house, the aunt locked the door tightly and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl crouching behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height didn't allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in your room?" growled the woman, the irritation intensified by the hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty, Auntie," murmured the girl, her big eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" The aunt laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the backyard. And since you like making so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." The child went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high walls and dominated by a single mango tree. There she sat on the ground and began to draw with a piece of charcoal she had found near the wood stove. They were always birds, small, large, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. The hours passed slowly. The aunt had locked the back door, leaving the girl in the backyard under the scorching midday sun. The child began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So she began to hum her mother's song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was this melody that reached the businessman's ears again. This time, he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar about that voice, that specific song. He picked up his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. As he recorded, fragments of memories began to fit together in his mind. His employee hummed that same song while she worked. The kind woman who had been an exemplary employee until she disappeared abruptly. The person who always spoke fondly about her little girl, a girl named her daughter, murmured the millionaire, the cell phone trembling in his hands. His former employee's daughter was named exactly that. The realization hit him like a punch in the stomach. The child suffering in the house across the street was the daughter of the kind woman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing. How hadn't he made this connection before? The businessman put away his cell phone and began to walk back and forth in his condo. He vaguely remembered the employee mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the problems at the company, that he hadn't paid due attention. Now, 5 years later, his ex-employee's daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt he carried multiplied, now including the regret for not having helped when she clearly needed it. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, punctually, the screams started again. This time, the millionaire didn't turn away from the window. He watched with growing horror as through the kitchen window of the Victorian house he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He picked up his cell phone again and started recording, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. The aunt was holding something in her hands. It seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and gesticulating violently towards a small figure that he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time the businessman couldn't pretend they were just childish tantrums. His financial assets, his investments in gold, and his reserves in euros seemed insignificant in the face of the urgency of the moment. All his wealth was worth nothing if he couldn't help a defenseless child who desperately needed protection. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. The question now was, what would he do with this information? That night, the girl slept on the floor of the backyard, where her aunt had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The child curled up in her own t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the mango tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent wish to her mother, wherever she was, that someone, anyone, would take her out of that place of pain. Across the street, the millionaire couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since his wife's departure. His net worth of millions couldn't buy courage to face the situation that was unfolding right before his eyes. 3 days had passed since the businessman discovered the child's identity, and the guilt consumed him like a slow fire. During these days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 o'clock, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that had haunted him since the night he lost his wife. On that Thursday morning, the retired schoolteacher made a decision that would change everything. She'd spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering just yards from her home. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and they were all present in the Victorian house. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of attempting another direct visit to the alcoholic aunt, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 in the morning, she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the place where she had the best view of the backyard of the Victorian house. What she saw horrified her. The girl was sitting under the mango tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and underwear. Her small arms were marked by obvious burns, some still red and inflamed. The child was drawing on the ground with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that the teacher recognized as birds. "My God!" whispered the educator, her hands trembling as she held the fence that separated the yards. It was worse than she imagined, much worse. The girl looked up and saw the lady watching her. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to the teacher's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved shyly. "Hi, Grandma," said the girl with her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all elderly ladies. "Hi, honey," replied the teacher, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Are you okay?" The child glanced quickly at the windows of the house before answering. "I'm fine. I'm just drawing birdies." "That's nice. Do you like birds?" "I like them a lot." "They can fly wherever they want," replied the girl, her big eyes shining with a sadness that broke the educator's heart. At that moment, the aunt's harsh voice echoed from inside the house. "Where are you, girl?" The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything the teacher needed to know. The girl got up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt, and ran into the house, but not before looking once more at the educator with an expression that screamed for help. The teacher remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the fear, the way the child reacted to the aunt's voice. Everything confirmed her worst fears. She could no longer pretend that she didn't know what was happening. Meanwhile, across the street, the millionaire had witnessed the entire interaction. Through his window, he was able to see the backyard partially, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him sick. For the first time in 5 years, he felt a genuine fury burning in his chest. His ex-employee had trusted him in some way, even if indirectly, even if he didn't know it at the time. She had left her daughter in the care of a family that lived in the same town where he lived. And now that child was being tortured while he watched from his comfortable condo, paralyzed by his own cowardice. All his investments in the stock market, all his fortune accumulated over decades, seemed insignificant in the face of the moral urgency he felt. His financial capital was worth nothing if he couldn't use his resources to protect a defenseless child. At 11 in the morning, the teacher made a courageous decision. She put on her best Sunday dress, took a tray of homemade cookies she had prepared as a pretext, and went again to the Victorian house. This time she wouldn't take no for an answer. The aunt answered the door reluctantly, clearly irritated by the neighbor's insistence. "Teacher, I already said it's not a good time." "Honey, I brought some cookies I made yesterday," interrupted the educator firmly, "and I insist on getting to know the little one better. As old neighbors, it's our duty to support each other." Before the aunt could protest, the teacher had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades of classroom experience had given her. The interior of the Victorian house was dark and smelled of mold mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the living room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. "The girl is sleeping," lied the aunt, blocking the way to the back of the house. "That's a shame. Maybe another time then," said the teacher, but her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that seemed to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the stove, and mainly small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible. The teacher and the aunt froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "It must be the neighbor's cat," said the aunt quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. The educator smiled and nodded, but she had decided that she had already seen enough. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But remember that I'm always right next door, if you need anything." Anything at all. The teacher's tone made it clear that it wasn't just a casual offer of help. It was a subtle but direct warning. After the educator left, the aunt locked the door tightly and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl huddled behind the gas stove, trying to hide. The child had cried when she heard the teacher's gentle voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. "You were making noise," accused the aunt, her eyes already shining with the familiar fury. "No, Auntie, I didn't make noise," protested the girl, but her small voice sounded weak even to her. The woman picked up the metal spoon that was on the stove and placed it directly in the flame. The child recognized the ritual and began to tremble. She knew what was coming next. "You want to draw attention, don't you?" hissed the aunt as the spoon heated up. "You want the neighbors to come here and ask questions. You think I don't know how to take care of you?" Across the street, the businessman had positioned his cell phone on the window and was recording again. This time, he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer. His ex-employee had been a good person, a dedicated employee who always spoke of her daughter with love. This child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. While the girl suffered another episode of systematic torture, the millionaire made a call he hadn't made in months. He called his personal lawyer and old college friend. "Robert, I need your help with a delicate situation," he said, watching through the window as the child's screams echoed through the afternoon. "It's about a child, and I think it might be a matter of life or death. His multi-million-dollar businesses, his investments in cryptocurrencies, and all his accumulated wealth seemed irrelevant in the face of the urgency of that moment. For the first time in years, he was willing to use all his wealth and influence for something that really mattered. That night, after the aunt fell asleep drunk on the living room sofa, the girl managed to slip silently into the backyard. Her new burns stung, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her heart. She sat under the mango tree and looked at the stars, humming her mother's song softly. What she didn't know was that, for the first time in months, someone was truly paying attention to her suffering. and that in the coming days her life would change in ways she couldn't even imagine. Across the street, the businessman had finally found a purpose for all his fortune: to save the daughter of the woman who had once worked faithfully for him. The lawyer arrived at the millionaire's condo on Friday morning with a grave expression on his face. The two men had been classmates at the university almost 3 decades ago, and Robert knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. That's why the urgent phone call the night before had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what's going on," said Robert, sitting in the spacious living room of the condo. "You talked about a child in danger, but I need details." The businessman poured coffee and stood next to the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. "The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She is being mistreated by the aunt who takes care of her." "Mistreated how?" asked Robert, taking a notepad from his briefcase. "Burns, daily screams, neglect." The millionaire paused, struggling with the words. "I have recordings, Robert. Evidence of what's happening." Robert was silent for a moment, processing the information. "This is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact Child Protective Services immediately." "I know," replied the businessman, running his hands over his face. "But there's something more. My ex-employee worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly in 2019, a few months before my wife's accident. I never understood why, but now you feel responsible," completed Robert, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. The millionaire nodded. "If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have needed to leave her daughter with that woman." At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and Robert could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. "Does this happen every day?" he asked, horrified. "At 3 in the afternoon religiously?" "But sometimes at other times too," replied the businessman, picking up his cell phone. "Do you want to see the recordings?" Robert watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a lawyer specializing in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse, but something in the systematization of that violence deeply disturbed him. "We can't wait any longer. I need you to give me all these recordings today. I'm going to contact Child Protective Services and the district attorney. This child needs to be removed from that house immediately." While the two men planned the intervention across the street, the girl was living another day of terror. The aunt had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol in the house. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the child had made on the kitchen wall during the night. "How many times do I have to tell you not to smudge the walls?" shouted the woman, holding the girl by the arm with enough force to leave marks. "You are a plague, a curse on this house." The child tried to explain, to say that she had dreamed of her mother and that the drawings made her feel less alone, but the words were lost in sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't fully understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new pain. "You're going to be locked in the room until I decide what to do with you," continued the aunt, pushing the girl down the hall. "And if I hear even one noise, you'll know a punishment you've never experienced before." The room where the child was locked was small and stuffy, with only a high window that she couldn't reach. There, she curled up in the corner and began to sing her mother's song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort in a world that seemed to have forgotten that she existed. It was this song that the retired schoolteacher heard when she passed by the house on her way to the grocery store. The educator had spent the entire night thinking about the conversation with the girl in the yard, the marks she had seen on the child's arms, the atmosphere of fear that permeated that house. The teacher stopped in front of the gate and listened. The girl's voice was weak, but filled with a sadness that broke the educator's heart. At that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to the grocery store, she went directly to the historic town center, where the small office of Child Protective Services was located. She knew the counselor well, a former student of hers who had dedicated herself to the protection of vulnerable children. "Anna, I need to talk to you about a very serious situation," said the teacher, entering the office without ceremony. The counselor looked up from the papers she was analyzing. "Teacher, it's good to see you. What brings you here today?" "A child in danger. My neighbor. I'm sure she's being mistreated." The counselor straightened up in her chair, her expression becoming immediately serious. During her 5 years as a Child Protective Services counselor, she had learned to recognize when a complaint was serious, and the teacher wasn't the type of person who would make frivolous accusations. "Tell me everything," said Anna, picking up a complaint form. While the educator related her observations, across town, Robert was in a similar meeting in the district attorney's office. The prosecutor listened attentively as Robert presented the evidence collected by the businessman. "This is compelling evidence," said the prosecutor, examining the videos on Robert's cell phone. "I'm going to order an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the family environment." "How long will this take?" asked Robert, worried. "With this evidence, we can act today," replied the prosecutor. "I'm going to contact Child Protective Services now." That's how, by a coincidence that would change the girl's fate, 2 simultaneous complaints reached Child Protective Services on the same morning. Anna was finishing writing down the teacher's account when her phone rang. "Child Protective Services, Anna speaking." "Anna, this is the prosecutor. I need you to make an urgent intervention at a house on Main Street. We have evidence of serious child abuse." Anna paused, the pen suspended over the paper. "Is it by any chance the yellow Victorian house?" "Exactly. How did you know?" "I just received a complaint about the same house," replied Anna, looking at the teacher with surprise. "2 independent sources. This confirms the gravity of the situation." At 2 in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being set up. Anna, accompanied by 2 social workers and a court officer, was heading to Main Street. The teacher had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. The millionaire watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. Robert was by his side, both witnessing the moment that would change the child's life forever. "You did the right thing," said Robert, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I hope it's not too late," replied the businessman, his eyes fixed on the team approaching the Victorian house. In the house, the aunt had gone out to buy alcohol, leaving the girl locked in the stuffy room. The child continued singing softly, unaware that her life was about to change radically. When Anna knocked on the door of the Victorian house and received no response, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside surpassed even their worst expectations. A dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol, and obvious signs of neglect in every room. It was the teacher who first heard the faint voice coming from the room in the back. "There's someone here," she said, guiding the team down the hall. When they opened the door to the room and found the girl huddled in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their heart. The child looked up with big, frightened eyes, not understanding who those people were or what they wanted from her. "Hi, honey," said Anna, crouching down to be at the child's height. "My name is Anna. We're here to help you." The girl looked at the teacher, recognizing the kind lady who had talked to her in the yard. A glimmer of hope shone in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by fear. "Auntie will be mad," she whispered. "You don't have to worry about that now," said the teacher, reaching out to the girl. "We're going to get out of here, okay?" And so, after 8 months of silent suffering, the child was finally removed from the house where she had known only pain and fear. Across the street, The millionaire watched with tears in his eyes, knowing that his fortune had finally served a truly important purpose. 6 months later, the girl was living in a caring foster home, attending a special school for traumatized children and receiving psychological counseling. The businessman, who had become her legal guardian, used his wealth to ensure that she had everything she needed to recover. The aunt was tried and convicted, receiving treatment for alcoholism in prison. But the most important thing was that the child, little by little, was smiling again, playing and drawing birds that now represented not only the dream of freedom, but the reality of a new and hopeful life. If you enjoyed this wonderful story, please comment. Giving a rating from 0 to 10, your opinion is very important. And if you love beautiful stories, subscribe to my channel. I promise to make your day better with my videos.